I think more shock and dauntingness was more of the feeling I felt. But it was, the thing is, it's...
The announcement lasted less than 3 minutes. Yet it completely shattered decades of constitutional expectations and redefined the future of the British monarchy forever. Standing side by side in front of the world's media, Prince William and Catherine, Princess of Wales, officially confirmed that their historic coronation ceremony would take place on June 2nd, 2027, beneath the ancient vaulted ceilings of Westminster Abbey. William spoke with measured strength, his voice carrying the calm authority of a man who had been prepared since childhood for this exact responsibility. But Catherine's subtle, trembling breath betrayed the immense private weight hiding behind those carefully chosen words. This was not merely a formal setting of a calendar date. It was the exact moment the British nation learned that the future had arrived far sooner than anyone had anticipated. As William tightened his hand around the mahogany lectern, he paused briefly before repeating the date once more, and that subtle pause conveyed everything he refused to speak aloud. June 2nd would fall exactly 74 years after Queen Elizabeth II was crowned in 1953, intentionally binding this new reign to the beloved monarch whose decades of selfless service had defined modern royalty. Westminster Abbey, the historic sanctuary where British sovereigns have been anointed for centuries, would now become the backdrop where a devoted son formally stepped into the ultimate role held by his living father. Catherine watched her husband with visible pride, though a deep current of sorrow moved quietly beneath her graceful expression. She understood better than anyone that taking the crown would not simply change their titles. It would permanently reshape their marriage, narrow their remaining privacy, and place Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis under the harsh, unrelenting glare of global scrutiny. The princess had spent weeks attending confidential consultations alongside William, King Charles, Princess Anne, and senior constitutional advisors, as well as the Archbishop of Canterbury, who traditionally conducts the sacred ceremony. When the official cameras finally stopped recording and the room fell into complete silence, William turned toward his wife and asked softly if she was truly ready for what lay ahead, to which Catherine reached for his trembling hand and answered that they simply had to be. Across London at Clarence House, King Charles sat alone in a private drawing room, listening to those exact words echoing through a television screen. The monarch lowered his reading glasses, stared at the silent broadcast, and said nothing for several long minutes. His formal decision to relinquish the throne had made this moment legally possible, yet hearing the date spoken aloud in public transformed a private family agreement into irreversible history. Resting on the desk beside him was a thick, sealed coronation file containing official plans for succession and the transfer of royal authority. When Charles finally opened the folder, he noticed that one original timeline had been crossed out in black ink, replaced by a handwritten note specifying June 2nd. That date had not been the initial choice, as the transition had originally been mapped out for autumn of 2027, until a confidential disagreement forced William to insist on an earlier timeline. That internal rift had cut deeper than any palace courtier publicly acknowledged, because behind the calm public announcement stood for individuals whose private sacrifices made the transition possible. William had prepared for kingship his entire life, but his training had never accounted for inheriting the throne through a living father voluntarily stepping aside rather than through the natural grief of loss. That distinction weighed heavily on his conscience, turning royal duty into subtle guilt and victory into something dangerously close to betrayal. Catherine shared this heavy burden, realizing that while becoming queen consort brought immense prestige, her primary instinct remained protecting 3 young children who were already being pulled into the institutional machinery. Shortly after the announcement, she entered Prince George's bedroom and found the young heir reading public reactions on a digital tablet. She gently closed the screen, reminding him that he was still allowed to be a child, to which George looked up and quietly asked if that would still be true after the coronation day arrived. Meanwhile, King Charles sat surrounded by his traditional red dispatch boxes, holding the final coronation briefing before requesting an aide to take it away. Though he firmly believed stepping down would shield the institution from ongoing uncertainty regarding his health, he was haunted by the fear that history might judge his sacrifice as a personal failure. His wife, Camilla, shared those anxieties from her own perspective, pouring tea in the quiet dining room and asking Charles whether June 2nd had truly been William's uncoerced choice. The king's hesitation answered her question without words, revealing that the date had emerged from immense internal pressure rather than total harmony. Camilla realized with growing unease that her own institutional influence would reach its natural end the exact moment Catherine was crowned queen. Sensing the dangerous rift forming within the family, Princess Anne stepped forward during a documented consultation, warning her brother that visible hesitation or resentment could cripple both his legacy and the beginning of William's reign, and made it clear that personal dignity now depended entirely on offering unambiguous, total support to the prince. Furthermore, Catherine held a secret of her own, a private letter entrusted to her by a palace custodian, written years prior by the late Queen Elizabeth for the woman who would next assume the role of senior royal matriarch. Before Catherine could even open that letter, William received an urgent message indicating that Charles would proceed with the transition, but only under one non-negotiable condition that threatened to bring father and son into direct emotional confrontation. The non-negotiable condition that King Charles imposed was not delivered through formal legal documents or official palace declarations, but through a heavily edited coronation order of service placed quietly between father and son on a long mahogany table in the private library at Windsor Castle. One specific paragraph had been aggressively crossed out in thick black ink, a passage detailing a precise ceremonial moment when the outgoing, abdicating monarch would publicly kneel before the new king and swear a formal oath of loyalty in front of millions of global viewers. To Charles, performing such an act before his own child felt like an unnecessary, public humiliation that would reduce his entire life's dedication to a single, devastating image of defeat. To William, however, that public pledge was the single most vital gesture capable of putting an end to months of dangerous media speculation, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that the transfer of power was seamless, harmonious, and fully endorsed by the sovereign himself. As tension rose in the quiet room, Charles ordered every remaining secretary and aide to leave, personally shutting the heavy wooden doors to ensure that no courtier would witness the raw confrontation between father and son. Pointing directly at the crossed-out lines, the king made it clear that while he had agreed to step aside for the stability of the crown, he would never kneel before his own son on a broadcast scene across the globe. William fought hard to keep his composure, arguing that the gesture was never meant to shame his father, but rather to give a nation and the Commonwealth absolute constitutional clarity during a fragile moment of transition. He explained that even a single gesture of hesitation or ambiguity during the ceremony could feed persistent rumors of internal division, coercion, or a crown handed over under duress. The roots of this intense confrontation trace back several months prior to a private service at St. George's Chapel, a moment that senior royals now recognized as the true point of no return. During a closed Order of the Garter rehearsal, Charles had suddenly stopped at an appointed ceremonial mark, looking toward the wrong side of the chapel and failing to respond when the next movement began. William had quietly stepped forward, whispered the correct instruction to his father, and completed the movement alongside him without missing a beat. Princess Anne had quickly signaled the musicians to keep playing, successfully hiding the brief lapse from surrounding staff. But the emotional damage had already been done. Once inside the private vestry, Charles turned on his son with a level of sharp anger that shocked those nearby, accusing William of looking far too eager to claim control of the institution. William had stood his ground, clenching his ceremonial gloves so tightly that the leather folded beneath his fingers, replying that he had only stepped forward because his father looked genuinely frightened. That single word pierced the king more deeply than any public political critique ever could, exposing the terrifying reality that his physical endurance was failing despite his fierce devotion to duty. And had later intervened during a recorded family consultation, bluntly telling Charles that the chapel incident was not a humiliation, but a merciful warning that a controlled, dignified transition was the only way to preserve his historic legacy before an unexpected crisis forced an abrupt transfer of power. Back in the library, as the argument over the coronation pledge reached a standstill, Charles pushed the altered document across the table, reminding William that while he had spent decades preparing to receive the crown, he had never once had to learn how to let it go. The king's voice remained controlled, but his words carried the weight of a lifetime spent waiting for a role that was now slipping away before history could fully record his impact. Standing up so suddenly that his chair slid backward, William made a painful confession of his own, admitting that while he had been trained since boyhood to prepare for the sovereign's death, he was entirely unprepared for something far more complex. Replacing a living father who was still fully aware, present, and forced to watch another man inherit his life's work. Catherine entered the library only after an aide informed her that the heated voices had suddenly fallen into a heavy silence. Looking at the exhausted faces of both men and the marked-up document between them, she refused to take sides, asking them directly whether they truly wanted the defining image of the new reign to be rooted in quiet resentment between father and son. Her steady presence broke the deadlock, prompting Charles to offer a dignified compromise. He would make the formal pledge of loyalty while standing upright, publicly recognizing William's sovereignty without appearing conquered before the world. Yet just as father and son achieved this fragile truce, a second and far more subtle battle was unfolding to the private offices of the palace. Camilla, deeply unsettled by how rapidly her own institutional standing would dissolve once Catherine was crowned queen consort, began using her remaining access to influence the Coronation Planning Council. Working through private requests sent to senior organizers in the Lord Chamberlain's office, she attempted to expand Charles's ceremonial role during the service, create a permanent post-abdication title for him, and alter the official procession path so that they would enter Westminster Abbey immediately before William and Catherine. When Catherine discovered these unauthorized schedule changes while reviewing updated procession files, she recognized that personal insecurity was threatening to disrupt constitutional clarity. Rather than confronting Camilla publicly or alerting William immediately, Catherine arranged a private meeting with the queen consort. In a candid, recorded conversation preserved by household notes, Camilla confessed her deep-seated fear of becoming entirely irrelevant the moment another woman assumed the crown, after spending decades fighting for public acceptance. Catherine listened with deep empathy, yet remained unwavering on the core principle: personal anxiety could never be allowed to rewrite the official succession or weaken the authority of the incoming sovereign. When Catherine gently set clear boundaries regarding the official succession, Camilla accepted the terms without further resistance, recognizing that attempting to reshape the coronation program would only weaken the dignity of the monarchy they both served. Princess immediately stepped in to oversee the planning committees, ordering every unofficial revision to be scrapped and restoring the original, approved procession route to ensure absolute constitutional clarity. When King Charles examined the finalized files, he felt a profound sense of relief, realizing that maintaining a unified, dignified front was the only way history would honor his decision to pass the crown. Yet the emotional core of this monumental shift was secured not in a public hall or before government officials, but inside the quiet confines of Windsor Castle, where William and Catherine stood together beside the official instrument of abdication, the historic document that would permanently surrender Charles's royal authority. William stared at the blank signature line, confessing to his wife that while he was fully prepared to lead a nation, he was terrified of how the weight of the crown might fracture their own family, fearing that George, Charlotte, and Louis might grow up feeling the same emotional distance he had experienced during his own youth. In response, Catherine produced a sealed letter left behind by the late Queen Elizabeth, breaking its red wax seal to reveal the final message written for the future queen. The late monarch's words carried timeless wisdom, warning them never to confuse stoic silence with strength, nor royal duty with the absence of genuine affection. She reminded them that the crown endures only when those who wear it remain human inside their own home. Moved by his grandmother's words, William took the draft coronation oath and wrote a solemn private promise along its margin, pledging that their children would never be treated merely as future instruments of state, ensuring that affection, openness, and family unity would remain at the heart of their home. Moments later, King Charles entered the room at his son's invitation. Standing face to face, William assured his father that the new reign would forever honor his extraordinary lifetime of service without attempting to erase his legacy. Charles nodded slowly, sat at the desk, and signed the abdication instrument with a steady hand, asking only that history remember his act as one protective love for the crown rather than retreat. Father and son embraced briefly, putting an official end to the internal struggle that had threatened to shadow the transition. By sunrise the following morning, the palace officially released the full coronation details to the global media, announcing June 2nd, 2027 as a historic date. Public reaction transformed almost instantly from anxious speculation to overwhelming support, as crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace, carrying signs that thanked Charles for his selfless service, while enthusiastically welcoming King William and Queen Catherine. When the sacred day finally arrived, the bells of Westminster Abbey chimed across London to herald the beginning of a new era. William and Catherine walked into the ancient sanctuary side by side in a powerful display of shared partnership, showing the world that the immense weight of the crown would no longer be carried in isolation. Charles sat quietly beside Camilla, watching with visible pride as his son approached the altar, fully at peace with his choice to step aside. The most defining moment of the entire ceremony occurred when Charles stood upright, looked directly at his son, and spoke his formal pledge of loyalty in a loud, unwavering voice, officially cementing William's undisputed authority as sovereign. Catherine received her crown moments later, immediately exchanging a warm, reassuring glance with Prince George to remind him of their private promise that family would always come first. As the royal procession departed Westminster Abbey under the roaring cheers of the nation, the long, turbulent journey towards accession reached its triumphant completion. The British monarchy had not merely survived a complex transfer of power, it had been renewed through reconciliation, proving that true royal strength lies not in clinging to power, but in knowing when to pass it forward with love and dignity.